Daryl Wilkins, manager of a KFC fast food restaurant on the outskirts of Evansville, Indiana, became alarmed when he noticed that the men's restroom had remained occupied for more than half an hour. The restaurant was crowded with customers during the lunch hour, and the line for the restroom was getting longer and longer. Disgruntled customers banged on the door, but there was no response. "Excuse me, sir," Daryl addressed the large man standing at the restroom door. "Is there anything going on in there?" "Someone's been closed and unanswered for about 15 minutes, the man replied irritably. Daryl tapped on the door with his knuckles. "Hey, who's there? We've got people waiting here." Silence. Sensing something wrong, Daryl pulled out the universal key. When the lock clicked and the door swung open, a scream caught in his throat. Inside, 2 bodies lay on the floor in pools of blood. A woman with her throat slit was half sitting, leaning against the wall, her eyes wide in perpetual wonder. A middle-aged man with multiple stab wounds in his chest and abdomen was prostrate nearby. His arms still seemed to be trying to defend himself against his attacker. Daryl slammed the door shut and, fighting a bout of nausea, dialed 911 with shaky hands. Detective Leroy Ngozi arrived on the scene 23 minutes after the dispatcher called. His shabby black sedan pulled into a parking lot already surrounded by police cars with flashing lights. Yellow police tape was stretched around the restaurant, with gawkers crowded behind it. Leroy sighed heavily, looking at the familiar KFC logo. 20 years on the force, 15 of them in homicide, and here he was, at the scene of a double murder in the restroom of a fast food restaurant. Evansville wasn't the center of crime, but things had been getting stranger lately. "What do we got here, Freddy?" Leroy asked the patrolman guarding the entrance. "Double homicide, sir. Male and female. Discovered by the manager of the establishment at about 12:30. Leroy nodded and, pulling on latex gloves, entered the restaurant. Inside, the uniformed staff sat in a group, some crying, others just looking shocked. The forensics team was already at work, taking pictures and gathering evidence. "Detective Ngozi," Leroy introduced himself, showing his badge to the medical examiner leaning over the bodies. "Dr. Parker," he replied, straightening up. "Quite a brutal murder. Preliminarily, I can tell you that both died of multiple stab wounds. The man suffered the brunt of the stab wounds to the chest, presumably hitting the heart. The woman suffered a slit throat and several wounds to the abdomen. Time of death, according to initial indications, between 11 and 12 o'clock. Leroy looked around the cramped restroom area. Blood splattered the walls, floor, and even the ceiling. The killer had acted in a rage, with incredible ferocity. Weapon? Not found. The killer probably took it with him. Any IDs? Driver's license was found in the woman's purse. Shanice Ezekiel, 28 years old. Male also has an ID Lamont Ezekiel, 51. Judging by the last name, probably relatives. Leroy frowned. Or husband and wife. The age difference is too great for a married couple, Dr. Parker pointed out. "Check the wedding rings," Leroy suggested. The doctor examined the hands of both victims. "The woman has a wedding ring. The man didn't." "Interesting," Leroy muttered. Perhaps a father and daughter-in-law. We'll have to check." Finished with the examination of the bodies, Leroy left the restroom and went to his partner, Detective Andre Jackson, who was already interviewing the manager of the establishment. "Yeah, we're checking the security tapes," Andre said, as he noticed Leroy approaching. "Mr. Wilkins has already given us access." "Good," Leroy nodded. "Let's see what we've got." They walked to a small office at the back of the restaurant. Daryl Wilkins, still pale and anxious, sat in front of a monitor. "We have cameras at the entrance, in the dining room, and in the parking lot," he explained. "But not in the hallway to the restrooms, or inside them, of course." Leroy and Andre focused on the footage. They started looking at the video from the cameras from about 10:30 in the morning. "Here," Andre pointed out at 11:02. This woman looks like the victim. Shanice Ezekiel entered the restaurant alone, bought a drink, and went straight to the restrooms. 4 minutes later, a parking lot camera recorded the arrival of a sedan from which a man matching the description of the second victim got out. Lamont Ezekiel walked briskly into the restaurant and, without stopping at the cash register, made his way to the restrooms. "And now for the best part," Leroy muttered, as a ragged pickup truck pulled into the parking lot at 11:21. A stout man jumped out of the car and practically sprinted into the restaurant. The camera inside caught him frantically looking around the room before heading for the restrooms. "There's our suspect," Andre said. "Wait, let's see what happens next." Leroy stopped him. About 7 minutes later, the same man ran out of the hallway with the restrooms. His face was contorted, his hands hidden in the pockets of his jacket. He quickly left the restaurant, got into his pickup truck, and drove away. "Do you know this man?" Leroy asked the manager, pointing at the screen. Daryl shook his head. "No, I don't recall. We have too many visitors every day. We need to enlarge the image and run it through facial recognition," Andre said. "In the meantime, we'll interview witnesses." Back in the dining room, the detectives split up to interview the employees and customers who were still in the restaurant. "I noticed that man because he seemed really agitated," said the cashier, a young girl named Tammy. "He didn't buy anything. He just ran past to the restrooms. And when he ran out of there, I was busy with a customer, but I caught a glimpse. He looked, like he'd seen a ghost. And yeah, I think he had blood on his hands. I thought maybe he cut himself or something." The other witnesses had little to add. Most paid no attention to the people coming and going, busy with their food. While Andre continued his questioning, Leroy went back to the camera footage. He scrutinized the suspect's face, trying to make out any special markings. The image enhancement program helped him get a clear enough portrait. "Run him through the database," Leroy asked the technician. A few minutes later, the results came up on the screen. "We got a match. Jamal Ezekiel, 34 years old, priors for assault and battery 5 years ago, but the case was dismissed. The victim recanted." "Ezekiel?" Leroy frowned. "Same last name as the victims. Check the connection between them." The technician quickly ran through the database. Jamal Ezekiel is Lamont Ezekiel's son and Shanice Ezekiel's husband. Leroy rubbed his chin, contemplating the situation. So he had caught his wife and father. The motive becomes clear. "Andre, he called out to his partner. "We have a suspect and a connection between him and the victims." After getting Jamal Ezekiel's address, the detectives decided to pay him a visit. They didn't yet know that he was already home and waiting for the inevitable call with the terrible news, pretending not to know. Jamal Ezekiel's home was a small one-story house in a working-class neighborhood in South Evansville. A shabby pickup truck, the same one they'd seen on the surveillance footage, was parked in the driveway. "Be careful," Leroy warned his partner. "If he killed 2 people in a state of passion, who knows what he'll do now?" They walked to the door, keeping their hands close to their weapons. Leroy knocked. "Evansville Police, Mr. Ezekiel." After a pause, the door opened. The same man from the surveillance cameras stood before them, now in clean clothes and with damp hair from a shower. There was a look of bewilderment on his face. "What can I do for you, officers?" "Detective Ngozi, homicide." Leroy introduced himself, showing his badge. "And this is my partner, Detective Jackson. Can we come in, Mr. Ezekiel?" Jamal hesitated for a second, then nodded and stepped aside. Sure. Is something wrong?" Inside, the house was modest, but tidy. Family photos hung on the walls, one of which showed Jamal hugging a woman the detectives identified as Shanice. "Mr. Ezekiel," Leroy began as they settled into the living room. "I'm sorry, but we have some bad news. Your wife, Shanice Ezekiel, was found dead today at a KFC restaurant on Lincoln Avenue." Jamal froze. His eyes widened and he leaned back in his chair. "What? No, that's not possible. She has to be at work." "I'm afraid that's not all," Leroy continued, watching the suspect's reaction carefully. "Your father, Lamont Ezekiel, was also found dead in the same place." Jamal's reaction was more complicated this time. The initial shock was replaced by an expression Leroy couldn't quite pinpoint, something between anger and relief? My father? Jamal interjected, his voice trembling. The two of them together? Yes, Leroy confirmed. Mr. Ezekiel, when was the last time you saw your wife? Jamal rubbed his face with his hands, looking confused. This morning. She left for work around 8 o'clock. I'm a mechanic at Black's Auto Service on 7th Street. Been there all morning. And your father? When was the last time you saw him? Last week. We're not very close. Leroy saw Jamal's fists clench at the mention of his father. Mr. Ezekiel, where were you today between 11 and 12 o'clock? Jamal tensed. At work, like I said. You can check. We will. Leroy nodded. But I should point out we have witnesses who say they saw you in KFC around that time. That's a mistake, Jamal objected quickly. I was not there. Why should I have been in KFC during working hours? Why indeed? Leroy said thoughtfully. Mr. Ezekiel, you'll have to come with us to the station for a formal interview. It's standard procedure in this situation. Yeah, am I under arrest? No, it's just an interview for now. Of course, you have the right to an attorney. Jamal nodded slowly, his gaze absent. Yes, of course, I'll go with you. As they left the house, Leroy noticed something glistening in the trash can by the garage. He made a mental note to request a search warrant for the house and grounds. Something told him that the murder weapon might be just around the corner. On the way to the station, Leroy pondered the contradiction between the camera footage and Jamal's version. They had a clear image of the suspect entering and leaving the restaurant in a highly agitated state, with signs of blood on his hands. But what brought him there? How did he know that his wife and father would meet at that location? And most importantly, what had happened between the three men that had led to such a violent outcome? Leroy Ngozi rubbed his eyes tiredly, looking at the computer screen in his office. The second day of the investigation, and he already felt that this case would not let him go for a long time. A double murder in a KFC bathroom. Father and daughter-in-law. Murdered, most likely by their own son and husband. It looked predictable, but something was bugging Leroy. Coffee? Andre Jackson set a steaming cup in front of his partner. Thank you, Leroy nodded, taking a sip of the scalding liquid. Let's go over the chronology again. They ran the security footage again, starting on the morning of the day of the murder. Shanice Ezekiel, a slender woman in tight jeans and a light-colored blouse, entered KFC at 11 hours and 2 minutes. Her movements were smooth, but her gait was tense. She ordered only a drink and went straight to the restrooms. Strange, Andre remarked. She didn't even try to find a table or eat anything. It was like she came for a specific purpose. Yeah, and look how she keeps checking her phone, Leroy pointed out. Like she's waiting for someone. 4 minutes later, the parking lot camera recorded the arrival of a black sedan. Lamont Ezekiel, a 51-year-old man of sturdy build with graying temples, stepped out of the car. He was in no hurry, but his gaze was focused on the restaurant entrance. He doesn't buy food, doesn't look around, Leroy commented as they followed Lamont's movements on the screen. He goes straight to the restrooms. Definitely an arrangement, Andre agreed. They had planned to meet there. But why in a fast food restroom? Leroy said thoughtfully. It's not the most romantic place for a date. Maybe they didn't want to be seen together, Andre suggested. KFC is far enough away from their homes and places of work. Or it was the only way to meet without arousing suspicion, Leroy added. Shanice could have told her husband she was going to lunch with a friend. They continued watching. At 11 hours and 21 minutes, a shabby blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. Jamal Ezekiel jumped out of the car and literally ran to the entrance of the restaurant. Look at the look on his face, Leroy pointed out. This is not the face of a man who just stopped for a bite to eat. He knew. But how? Andre asked. How did he know that his wife and father were dating? That's what we have to find out, Leroy replied, taking notes. Check his phone records and GPS data. He may have been tracking his wife. There was a knock on the office door. It was Mary Chang, an expert from the tech department. "Detectives, I have the autopsy results," she said, holding out a folder. "Dr. Parker asked me to give them to you personally." Leroy opened the folder and began to review the report. The primary cause of Shanice's death was carotid artery dissection with a sharp object, presumably a knife. Additional injuries included 3 stab wounds to the abdomen. Lamont Ezekiel died from multiple stab wounds to the chest area, one of which penetrated the heart. The body showed defensive wounds to the hands and forearms. Time of death between 11 hours 25 minutes and 11 hours 35 minutes, Leroy read. Matches our chronology. Jamal entered the restaurant at 11:23 and left at 11:30. And something else interesting, Andre added, looking at the last pages of the report. Both victims showed signs of recent sexual activity. Leroy nodded. The picture was getting clearer, but there were still gaps to fill. "We need their cell phones," he said. "Especially the correspondence between Shanice and Lamont." The tech department was already working on extracting data from the victims' phones. By lunchtime that afternoon, Mary Chang brought in another report. "You won't believe what I found," she said, looking excited. Shanice's phone was full of messages from Lamont, hidden in a secure app. They had been communicating for months. Leroy looked through the printouts of the messages. The correspondence had started innocently, requests to pass something on to Jamal, discussions about family reunions. But gradually, the tone had changed, becoming more personal, more intimate. Lamont often mentioned that Jamal didn't deserve a woman like Shanice. In recent messages, they'd arranged to meet in KFC. "Meet me where you suggested." At 11 o'clock. He'll never know, read the last message from Lamont. "I can see why they chose a place like this," Leroy said thoughtfully. "Public, but with privacy, and far enough away from Jamal's work." "But how did he find them?" Andre asked again. Mary showed another document. Shanice's phone had a location tracking app installed, and Jamal was connected to her account. "That's the answer." Leroy nodded. He saw that she wasn't at work, but in KFC, so he decided to check it out. And when he saw his father's car in the parking lot, everything fell into place, Leroy finished. "But we need more. Let's talk to Shanice's co-workers, find out how things went down in their marriage." Shanice Ezekiel worked as a cashier at a small clothing store in a shopping center. Her boss, a full-figured middle-aged woman named Beverly, seemed genuinely saddened when detectives informed her of her co-worker's death. "Poor Shanice," Beverly sobbed. "She was such a sweet girl, always punctual, polite to customers." "Mrs. Baker," Leroy began. "Have you noticed anything unusual in Shanice's behavior lately? Maybe she seemed anxious or overly happy?" Beverly hesitated for a moment. Now that you ask. Yeah, she's changed in the last couple months. She's been taking better care of herself, changing her hair, wearing more makeup, and she smiled a lot on her phone." "Did she ever talk about marriage problems?" "Oh yes," Beverly nodded. "Not that she complained directly, but I heard her discussing it with the other girls. Jamal was, not the type to show his feelings. She said he cared more about his cars than he did about her." "And her father-in-law? Did she mention him?" "Lamont?" Beverly frowned. "A couple times. Said he was the only one who knew how to treat her. I thought it was weird to talk about my father-in-law that way." After talking to the supervisor, detectives spoke to 2 of Shanice's co-workers, who confirmed the growing tension in her marriage. One of them, Keisha, mentioned that Shanice had come to work several times with bruises that she tried to cover up with makeup. "She never admitted it was Jamal," Keisha said, "but we all knew. And then there was this man who started picking her up after work." "A man?" Leroy asked. "Can you describe him?" "Older, well-dressed. I've only seen him a couple times. Shanice said he was her father-in-law, just giving her a ride home when Jamal was late for work. But there was something about it wrong." After gathering information at the store, detectives decided to talk to Lamont's relatives to understand the father-son relationship. Lamont's sister, Cora Ezekiel, lived in a small apartment on the east side of town. A gray-haired woman with a tired look greeted them warily. "I've heard about Lamont before," she said when the detectives introduced themselves. "Terrible." "Mrs. Ezekiel, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your brother's relationship with your son," Leroy began after they were seated in the small living room. Cora sighed. They had never gotten along. Lamont was a complicated man, very overbearing. He'd controlled every aspect of Jamal's life since he was a child. In what way? In every way. What clothes to wear, who to be friends with, where to go to school. When Jamal refused to join the army like his father wanted and became a mechanic, Lamont almost disowned him. And then Shanice came along. And what changed? Lamont suddenly became interested in his son's life again. He started coming to visit, bringing gifts. But he wasn't doing it for Jamal. Cora shook her head. I saw the way he looked at Shanice. It was wrong. Do you think they were in a relationship? I don't know for sure. But Lamont always took what he wanted without regard for other people's feelings. And Shanice was a young, beautiful woman in an unhappy marriage. How did Jamal feel about reconnecting with his father? He was glad at first. He always sought Lamont's approval, even when he said he hated him. But in recent months, he's gotten suspicious. I heard them arguing once. Jamal yelled something about betrayal. After getting this information, detectives decided to talk to Jamal's best friend, Tyreek Montgomery, who worked with him at Black's auto shop. The tall, thin man with a nervous tic in his left eye looked uncomfortable when the detectives approached him in the garage. Jamal had nothing to do with this, Tyreek said at once, even before Leroy had a chance to introduce himself. He'd been here all morning, working on Mr. Randall's Ford Explorer together. "Mr. Montgomery," Leroy said calmly, "we just want to ask you a few questions. Did you know Lamont Ezekiel, Jamal's father?" Tyreek licked his lips nervously. "Not much. Saw him a couple times when he went to pick Jamal up. How would you describe their relationship?" "Tense," Tyreek answered after a pause. "Lamont always looked down on Jamal, like he wasn't good enough. You know, Jamal told me how, when he was a kid, his father made him run laps around the house if he got bad grades. And lately? Have you noticed a change in their relationship? Yeah, it's gotten worse. Jamal was sure his father was trying to steal Shanice away. He saw the way he looked at her, the way he touched her. And what had Jamal said about it? He was furious, of course. He said several times he'd kill the old man if he didn't leave Shanice alone. But they're just words, you know? Jamal wouldn't. "Mr. Montgomery," Leroy interrupted him. "You say Jamal was here all morning the day of the murder. What time did he leave for lunch?" Tyreek hesitated. "Well, he didn't leave. I mean, maybe he went out for a little while. I don't remember exactly." "You don't remember? You just said you worked together on Mr. Randall's car." "Yes, but, I went to the office to check on a parts order. Maybe he went out while I was gone." "How long were you gone for?" Tyreek rubbed his neck. 40 minutes, maybe an hour. "So between 11 and 12, Jamal could have been out of the shop?" "Yeah, I can't say for sure, but he's a good guy, detective. He's not a killer." Leroy wrote down the statement, realizing Jamal's alibi was falling apart. Tyreek was clearly trying to defend his friend, but he was confused by his own words. Leaving the auto shop, the detectives decided to check out the KFC restaurant and the surrounding area once more, hoping to find additional witnesses. Their persistence was rewarded. The owner of a nearby auto parts store recalled seeing a man running out of the restaurant that day. "I was just putting the merchandise out on the street," said Aaron Green, an older man with a bushy gray mustache. "And I noticed this guy because he jumped out like a scalded man and ran to his car. He had bloodstains on his sleeves. I thought maybe he'd hurt himself." "Could you identify this man?" Leroy asked, showing Jamal's picture. "Oh yes, that's him." Aaron nodded confidently. "That's him. I memorized his face because he looked, like he'd seen a ghost. Pale, wild eyes. What else did you notice? Not well, he jumped in his car and took off so fast the tires squealed. But before that, Aaron lowered his voice. It looked like he threw something into a trash can in the parking lot. This information led the detectives back to the trash cans in the KFC parking lot. With warrant in hand, they thoroughly checked the entire contents, but to no avail. The trash had been removed that afternoon. That lead, however, led them back to Jamal's house. Armed with another warrant, they searched the trash cans outside his home and found a bloody t-shirt wrapped in a plastic bag. A preliminary test showed the blood belonged to two different people. In the garage, they found bleach-soaked rags and recently washed tools. On one of them, a folding utility knife, forensics found traces of blood in microscopic crevices that could not be completely cleaned. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer and clearer. Jamal had somehow found out about the meeting between his wife and father, followed her to KFC, and, finding them together in the bathroom, killed them both in a fit of rage. All that remained was to hear his version of events. The Evansville police station interrogation room seemed even smaller than usual as Leroy Ngozi and Andre Jackson took their seats across from Jamal Ezekiel. Between them on the metal table lay a thin folder of collected evidence. Jamal sat with a stony expression, his hands calmly folded in front of him. The court-appointed attorney was seated next to him, tapping his pen nervously on his notepad. "Mr. Ezekiel," Leroy began, turning on the recorder. "Today is August 21st, 14 hours and 30 minutes. This is the official interrogation in the murder case of Shanice Ezekiel and Lamont Ezekiel." Jamal nodded, his eyes remaining blank and lifeless. "Are you still claiming that you were at work between 11 and 12 o'clock on the day of the murder?" Leroy asked, opening the folder. "Yes," Jamal answered firmly. "I was at Black's auto shop, working on a customer's car." "Interesting," Leroy said, laying the surveillance photos on the table, "because here you are entering KFC at 11 hours and 23 minutes. Jamal cast a quick glance at the photo and looked away. "That's not me." Leroy put another picture next to it. And here you are coming out of there at 11 hours and 30 minutes. Notice in these shots you can clearly see the stains on your clothes, which the experts have identified as traces of blood. "I'm telling you, it wasn't me," Jamal repeated, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Mr. Ezekiel," Andre intervened, "we have a witness, Aaron Green, the owner of the auto parts store next door, who saw you running out of the restaurant with bloody hands." "He's wrong," Jamal replied stubbornly. Leroy pulled out another document. "We got the GPS data from your cell phone. It clearly shows that you left the service station at 11 hours and 12 minutes and arrived in KFC at 11:21. You returned to work at 11:53. The lawyer leaned over to Jamal and whispered something, but he only shook his head. "That still doesn't prove anything," he said. "Maybe I stopped for a bite to eat. In that case," Leroy continued, pulling out another document. "How do you explain the fact that you had an app installed on your phone to track your wife's location, and that a few minutes before you left work, you were checking to see where she was?" Jamal's face twitched, but he quickly got over his emotions. "I just wanted to see if she wanted to have lunch with me. Saw that she was in KFC, so I thought I'd join her. But when I got there, I couldn't find her." "What about your father? Did you see his car in the parking lot?" "No, I didn't pay attention." Leroy leaned back in his chair and exchanged glances with Andre. It was time for the heavier artillery. "Mr. Ezekiel, when we searched your home, we found a bloody t-shirt wrapped in a plastic bag in the garbage can. Preliminary tests showed that the blood belonged to two different people. Jamal was visibly tense. I cut myself at work, and I threw the shirt away because it couldn't be washed." "And the second source of the blood?" Andre asked. "The DNA analysis isn't ready yet, but I'm sure the results will match your wife and father." "My client will not answer any further questions without concrete evidence," the lawyer intervened. Good, Leroy nodded. Then let's talk about the knife we found in your garage. Despite careful cleaning, traces of blood were found in the crevices. Again, of two different people. Jamal swallowed, his confidence beginning to crumble. It's a work knife. I use it every day. In that case, Leroy placed another photograph in front of him. Explain this. This was taken by a KFC parking lot camera. There's your pickup truck, and there's you, throwing something in the dumpster. Forensics was able to zoom in on the image, and it looks like it's a knife. It was a half-truth. The quality of the image didn't allow them to determine exactly what Jamal was throwing. But the bluff worked. The suspect's face contorted, and he lowered his gaze to his hands. Mr. Ezekiel, Leroy said softly. We also checked your wife and father's cell phones, found their correspondence going back several months. They were planning this meeting in KFC. When Jamal heard that, he looked up, and there was pure pain in his eyes. You don't understand, he whispered. You don't know what he was like. Tell us, Leroy suggested. Help us understand what happened. Jamal was silent for a long moment, breathing deeply, as if trying to cope with the storm of emotions inside. Then he nodded, more to himself than to the detectives. I began to suspect a few months ago, he said quietly. Shanice had changed. She'd become distant, often staying late after work. And my father. He came to our house more often, brought Shanice gifts. I saw the way he looked at her. Jamal took a deep breath before continuing. I installed an app on her phone. Just wanted to know if she was lying to me. And I noticed a strange pattern. Once or twice a week she'd go to different places, but she never told me about it. Sometimes a restaurant, sometimes a motel on the outskirts of town. His voice shook. That day I checked and saw that she was in KFC, even though she was supposed to be at work. I decided to check, and as I pulled up to the restaurant, I saw my dad's car in the parking lot. Jamal fell silent, immersed in the memories of that fateful day. He drove, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his heart beating somewhere in his throat. The only thought pulsing in his head was, please let it be a coincidence. But when he saw his father's black sedan parked next to Shanice's car, something inside shivered. He knew. Deep inside, he already knew what was happening, but he refused to believe it. Jamal burst into the restaurant, frantically looking around. Not spotting his wife or father in the dining room, he headed for the restrooms. The men's restroom was empty. He stopped in front of the women's door, but didn't dare enter. Instead, he stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, trying to gather his thoughts. A few minutes later, an unfamiliar woman came out of the women's restroom. Jamal waited for her to leave, then cautiously opened the door and peered inside. It was empty. But then, where were Shanice and Lamont? Just then he heard muffled voices coming from the handicapped restroom at the end of the hallway. Jamal crept to the door, listening. He recognized his wife's voice, then his father's laughter, then sounds that left no doubt as to what they were doing. Jamal felt a wave of rage come over him. He pulled the folding knife he always carried with him for work from his pocket and quietly opened the lock with the universal key he had for the workshop. What he saw was forever imprinted on his memory. Shanice against the wall, and his father behaving inappropriately toward her. They didn't even notice him right away. I don't remember exactly what happened next, Jamal continued in the interrogation room, his voice lifeless. It was like I was watching from the sidelines. All I remember is the screaming, the blood, and the knife in my hand. He looked up at the detectives. I killed them both. My father first. He tried to stop me, to defend himself, but I was stronger. And then Shanice. She begged me to stop, but I couldn't. All I saw was betrayal. There was a heavy silence. Leroy and Andre looked at each other, but did not interrupt the suspect's confession. You know what the worst part is? Jamal continued. When I was about to leave, I noticed my father's cell phone on the floor. I unlocked it. I knew the code, It was his wedding date, he never changed it. And I saw their correspondence. Jamal grinned bitterly. He was writing to her, "Jamal will never know. He is too weak to stand up to me, always has been. I will take everything he loves from him, just like I always have." It was like my whole life with him flashed before my eyes. Leroy nodded, encouraging him to continue. "My father has always controlled me." Jamal looked somewhere past the detectives. "Ever since I was a kid. If I got a B instead of an A, he'd make me run laps around the house until I collapsed from exhaustion. If I was friends with someone he didn't like, he would find a way to ruin that friendship. The first time I fell in love, he seduced this girl just to show me he could." Jamal clenched his fists. "When I met Shanice, I thought I had finally escaped his shadow. We moved to a different neighborhood. I barely spoke to him at all. But then he reappeared in our lives. At first I was excited. I thought he'd changed, wanted to mend things. But he just found a new way to destroy me." "He seduced your wife," Leroy said quietly. "Yes," Jamal nodded. "But not just seduced her. He manipulated her. Told her I was just like him, that I'd end up hurting her. Convinced her that the only way to be safe was to be with him. I saw their correspondence. He played on her fears, her insecurities." Leroy made a note in his notebook. What started out as a simple case of a crime of passion turned out to be much more complicated, a story of years of psychological manipulation and a toxic relationship. "What did you do after the murder?" Andre asked. "I went out the back door, threw the knife in the trash can behind the restaurant," Jamal replied. "I came home, burned my clothes in a barrel in the backyard, took a shower, then drove back to work as if nothing had happened. And the t-shirt we found? I didn't notice the bloodstain on it right away. When I did, I wrapped it in a bag, was gonna burn it later." Leroy slammed the folder shut and turned off the recorder. "Jamal Ezekiel, you're under arrest for the first-degree murder of Lamont Ezekiel and Shanice Ezekiel. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal listened to his rights with a detached expression. When the officers handcuffed him and led him to his cell, he looked almost relieved, as if the weight of the confession had lifted some of the burden from his shoulders. Later, when all the formalities were completed, Leroy and Andre sat in the office discussing the case. "Do you believe his story?" Andre asked. "About his father and all that manipulation?" Leroy tapped his pen on the desk thoughtfully. "I checked what I could. His ex-girlfriend from college did confirm that Lamont seduced her. Teachers at the school remembered him being an overly strict father. And we've seen the correspondence between him and Shanice. He was definitely manipulating her, playing on her fears." "But that doesn't justify a double murder," Andre pointed out. "Of course not," Leroy agreed. "But it helps to understand how it came to this. Sometimes the most brutal crimes grow out of the most ordinary family dramas. Lamont had been controlling his son all his life, and when he finally tried to create something of his own, he couldn't let it happen. A psychopath." Andre shook his head. "Maybe," Leroy nodded. "Or just a man who himself had grown up in a toxic environment and didn't know any other way to relate. Either way, the cycle of violence continued and led to tragedy." Leroy walked to the window and looked out at the evening Evansville. Somewhere out there, in ordinary homes behind closed doors, similar dramas were probably unfolding. The little daily humiliations, the manipulation, the control, all the things that one day could escalate into violence. "You know what the saddest part is?" he said. "Jamal spent his whole life trying to break free from his father's control, to prove he wasn't like that. And in the end, he did exactly what Lamont's worst expectations were." "Do you think he's remorseful?" Andre asked. "I think so," Leroy answered. "But not for killing them, but for letting his father win even after his death. He gathered up the documents and locked them in the safe. The case was practically closed. Technical evidence, testimony, and confessions provided a strong evidentiary base. The prosecutor had already talked about the possibility of a plea bargain in exchange for life in prison instead of the death penalty. Leroy knew Jamal would take that deal. He wasn't trying to avoid punishment, wasn't looking for excuses for his actions. In his eyes, the detective saw the humility of a man who had finally stopped fighting. With his father, with himself, with his demons. Leaving the station in the late afternoon, Leroy thought about how thin the line between love and obsession, between care and control, and how easily that line blurs when power, jealousy, and years of accumulated resentment come into play. In his 20 years as a police officer, he has seen many crimes of passion, but this case left a special mark. Not because of the brutality of the murder, but because of the tragic inevitability with which one devastating decision led to the loss of 3 lives, 2 physical and 1 spiritual.